This time around, Trump's coming back with a vengeance. He's not ready to accept or tolerate adults in the room if they're not loyalists. So we don't really know how a second-term Trump foreign policy could be different.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. It was neither a surprise nor an upset, but Donald Trump overwhelmingly won the United States presidential election. Republicans will also control the United States Senate. Control of the House of Representatives at this point is still undecided. Joining me less than 24 hours after this election is Robbie Gramer, national security correspondent for Politico and host of Politico's excellent NatSec Daily newsletter. Very few people are as plugged into both the political and foreign policy worlds as Robbie Gramer, so I thought it would be valuable to learn what he is hearing from his sources about the foreign policy implications of a second Donald Trump term and the potential Republican control of all houses of Congress. The future of U.S. foreign policy and, frankly, of the liberal international order and of multilateralism will certainly be a topic that we cover extensively in this podcast over the next, several months and years. For now, however, I thought that this quick take from one of the best journalists in the business would be extremely useful for you, dear listener. And I will have more of my own thoughts as well about what this election means for the United Nations, both in the podcast and our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell, and on the newsletter at globaldispatches.org. For now, though, here is my conversation with Robbie Gramer, national security reporter for Politico. Robbie, I'm happy you're here because there are honestly very few people who are as plugged in as you are to both politics and foreign policy. So I just have a very general question to kick off. What have you been hearing from your sources last night and throughout the day today? And we're speaking Wednesday afternoon after the election about the impact of this election on U.S. foreign policy.
Well, it's clear it's going to be a shock to the system of U.S. foreign policy and global politics. Again, Trump coming back on stage. A lot of people say, look, we had 4 years of Trump. We know what we're getting. But there is still an element of we don't really know what's coming because a second Trump term is not seen in the same way a first Trump term is. In the first Trump term, you had this phrase that was thrown around often, quote unquote, adults in the room. You had people like Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, the first Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, National Security Advisor John Bolton, who espoused these more traditional foreign policy establishment views and in some ways sort of penned in Trump and Trump's instincts on foreign policy. This time around, Trump's coming back with a vengeance. He's not ready to accept or tolerate adults in the room if they're not loyalists. So we don't really know how a second-term Trump foreign policy could be different. It could be completely unshackled. There could be a lot more unpredictability. It could sort of revert back to some of what we're seeing from Trump with different flavors and flares here and there of America first in foreign policy. But it's a weird sort of dual narrative playing out right now of we've seen what we've gotten. We've seen Trump for the past 4 years. We know where we're getting, but also this is Trump 2.0. And on a new level, we don't quite know what we're getting.
And it seems, therefore, that personnel choices might be determinative going forward, if indeed that adults in the room are just now ensconced in think tanks that have no hope of returning to a Trump administration. Is there like a sense, and again, we're speaking very early after the election, of like who some of these key national security, foreign policy personnel picks might be and what that might mean for how a second Trump term approaches foreign policy?
Yeah, first off, you're absolutely right. There's that old adage that personnel is policy. A lot of senior foreign diplomats I've talked to say they're following closely who Trump will pick as defense secretary, secretary of state, and national security advisor. Now, that might not seem obvious, but when you have that degree of unpredictability I just talked about, who he picks for some of these top jobs will say a lot about the approach he's taking to foreign policy. Some of the names that have been floated out there, and I will caution, this is all speculation. No one's confirmed anything. We're just 24 hours out.
Less.
Less than 24 hours out. You're
Yeah.
right. From the election results coming in. Richard Grenell, his former ambassador to Germany and acting director of national intelligence.
Yeah, I would interact with Rick Grinnell back in the day when he was John Bolton's spokesperson
Yeah.
at the United Nations back when I first
Yeah,
started covering the UN
exactly.
like 20 years ago.
And, he's interesting because he sort of grew up, so to speak, in the foreign policy establishment on the Republican side, but has really embraced this pugnacious America first flair on foreign policy. He's seen as a top contender for Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. I've talked to some in Congress, others in the campaign circles who aren't sure if he would be able to become Secretary of State given how close the Senate is. That's a job that obviously requires Senate confirmation, a majority, at least 51. So he might go for someone like Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee, who's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Trump's former ambassador to Japan. And in that case, Grinnell could be a top contender for Trump's national security advisor, a job that does not require Senate confirmation, unlike a Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. Some other names we've heard are Florida Congressman Mike Waltz for defense secretary or a top intelligence official job. He's a big advocate for Trump brand America First foreign policy. He's a U.S. Army veteran of special forces. There are some other names out there like Robert O'Brien, his former national security advisor, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, another early Trump critic in 2016 who has come around and embraced the Trump brand of the Republican Party. So, all told, some of these names I think would bring some relief to some nervous allies in Asia, some nervous allies in Europe, especially Ukraine. Marco Rubio is seen as very hawkish on Russia. Robert O'Brien is seen as more pro Ukraine. Mike Waltz is also seen as pretty hawkish on Russia and China. It all sort of depends on what flavor of America first foreign policy Trump would like to take. And it could depend on the region. There could be a more traditional Republican establishment official in charge of, say, Iran policy, and a more MAGA, shake up the room, America firster person in charge of Ukraine policy.
Hmm.
That's a long winded way of saying we just don't know yet. There's a lot of unpredictability here.
And from the international diplomats that you've spoken with, I mean, the first kind of consequence everyone's thinking of is Ukraine and what might befall Ukraine's ability to defend itself from Russia at the moment. Like, how much consternation, again, we're speaking very early, is there among the international diplomats that you've been speaking with in these, several past hours?
It's a bit of a Rorschach test when you talk to both foreign diplomats and also, Washington's national security establishment. Those that are more skeptical of continuing assistance to Ukraine say, yeah, Trump is going to be more skeptical. He might cut Ukraine aid off and really push both sides to stop the war. Those that are a lot more pro-Ukraine say, no, Trump will, continue to be pro-Ukraine in his own MAGA way. And so they really sort of imprint their hopes and wishes on Ukraine policy onto Trump, which again lends itself back to sort of the unpredictability that we have here. I mean, I think there are Europeans right now that are sort of either through desperation or through some cold calculation saying that Trump could be good for Ukraine policy, that, he is a transactional man, but he's also someone who doesn't like to be seen as a loser. Trump has said he would bring peace in Ukraine in his first 24 hours on the job. He has declined to elaborate on any specifics about what that means. But there are some senior European officials who say, look, Trump's unpredictability and his desire to be a winner could make this a strong formula for promoting a peace process in Ukraine that is viable and doesn't hand an easy victory to Russian President Vladimir Putin. The other element for some of the more optimistic camp here is that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are all becoming very much more interlinked. You see North Korean soldiers in Russia, Iran supporting Russia with drones and missiles, and China indirectly supporting Russia. A lot of Europeans say, look, maybe Trump could care less about the European Union and European allies. But we know two things. We know he hates China. We know he hates Iran. Handing a victory to Putin in Ukraine, by extension, hands a victory to Beijing, hands a victory to Tehran. And that's not something that he wants. And that's not something that some of the big hawks in Trump's Republican foreign policy camp want either. So there is a sense of roundabout optimism here that,
Hmm.
hey, maybe Trump will shake things up on Ukraine, but maybe it won't be all doom and gloom.
So you and Nahal Tusi just a couple hours ago published a really interesting article in Politico examining the kind of early ways or how the Biden administration is seeking to so-called Trump-proof certain aspects of U.S. foreign policy during this forthcoming lame duck session. What are you seeing to that end?
The model here is from Trump himself. Trump, in his last final few weeks in office before Biden took over in 2021, pushed through some last minute foreign policy initiatives that were designed to box Biden in. A few examples. They labeled China's crackdown on its ethnic Uyghur Muslim population as a genocide. Pompeo looked to ease restrictions in how American officials could engage Taiwanese officials in a way that could be seen as undercutting the US's longstanding one China policy. They slapped a foreign terrorist organization designation on the Houthi rebels in Yemen, despite some opposition from humanitarian groups who say that designation would make it more difficult for them to get humanitarian aid to civilians in Houthi controlled areas. They put Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list. They recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the disputed territory of Western Sahara in exchange for helping grease the wheels on Morocco normalizing ties with Israel. This was all done, this flurry of actions was all taken within the final days and weeks of the administration. And some of them worked. Biden has reneged some of them, such as the Houthi FTO designation, but he's also kept some in place. And so there's some thinking right now in the Biden camp, even as they're despondent and reeling from the shock of Kamala Harris's election loss, of what are some things that we can box Trump in on, either make it more difficult to undo Biden's legacy or try to cement something that his team just doesn't care enough about to proactively undo and maybe write out for the next 4 years. One of them is shoveling as much money as possible to Ukraine. There's about $6 billion left in the pot of money that Congress allocated to the Biden administration for Ukraine. So they're going to try to shovel a lot out the door for Ukraine before January 20th when Trump takes office. There might be other policies where they try to pressure Israel and its ongoing offensives on the Middle East. But those conversations are in early stages right now.
I mean, it sounds like there's really limited steps the Biden administration could take. I mean, this idea of like trying to get as much of that $6 billion out the door seems to be like almost a consequence of like physics, right? There's only so many munitions you could procure and buy and ship between now and day one of the Trump administration.
Yeah, that I think you hit the nail on the head there. That's a great way to put it. It's not like we have $6 billion worth of battle ready equipment sitting in a factory right now collecting dust that we can just ship to them. A lot of this money would be allocated and promised for shipments in the future. Trump could cut those off at any point, but there is a concerted effort by top members of the Biden administration, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, to get as much of those commitments out the door to Ukraine as possible.
So I know that you report very closely on Congress as well. We know right now the Senate will be in Republican hands. What do you foresee as some of the key early consequences of that? Obviously, that means that the Republicans will have great leverage over personnel choices that we discussed earlier. It will be easier to get Trump's picks through the Senate confirmation process. What do you foresee as being the big kind of foreign policy consequences of the Senate returning to Republican hands?
Yeah, I mean, it takes one more break off of Donald Trump's MAGA train here. And the House, we might not know the outcome of who controls the House for weeks. There could be a possibility where the Republicans have a narrow margin of control in the House, which gives the Republicans control of all three sectors here. And that would stop, for better or worse, any sort of break or inhibition on Trump's term two MAGA agenda. In terms of the practicalities, I think the Senate side is more important than the House side. And, the Senate Foreign Relations, it's going to be led by Jim Risch.
A fellow Idahoan,
Yeah,
as you
fellow
are as
Idahoan,
well.
just like me.
Well, I know that you know him very well. Just you've reporting on him for a long time. You have that Idaho connection. Like, what do we need to know about Jim Risch? I mean, he's been the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before. He's now
Yeah,
the ranking member. What influence might he have from that perch?
he is I would say, a hybrid of the MAGA and traditional Republican foreign policy view. He's come out as very pro-Trump. He is very reluctant to criticize the former and soon to be president. But he also is, very hawkish against Russia, very pro Ukraine, very anti China. The other thing is, he is not a firebrand. He is not one who loves to go on TV shows and radio shows all the time. He works a lot behind the scenes. So you might not see it play out in public view, but I think he is one lawmaker who is influential behind the scenes and saying, hey, maybe we need to support Ukraine. Hey, maybe we need to toughen up our stance on Russia. Whether that's successful or not remains to be seen. Interestingly, Ben Cardin, the Maryland Democrat, is retiring. He is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee now that Bob Menendez, the New Jersey Democrat, had to resign amid this corruption scandal. The next person who's taking over as top Democrat is Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire. She and Risch, from everything I've heard, have a much better working relationship. Neither of them are really partisan firebrands who like to throw punches in public. So you could see a good, productive working relationship there that might be a stark contrast to what you see playing out in public in other parts of foreign policy in the Trump era.
So lastly, again, we're speaking just, hours after the polls closed, but in the coming weeks, what indicators will you be looking towards to suggest to you what tact a potential Trump foreign policy might take?
The first is what we talked about, personnel, who he'd like to tap to be defense secretary, secretary of state, other top posts. I think a lot of people would be paying attention to what he says on Ukraine, what he says on Israel. Biden has faced pressure from the progressive flank of his own party to try and play more hardball with Israel as it carries out its controversial campaigns in Gaza and Lebanon. Under Trump, you might just see fully unfettered support for Israel, or you might see some of his transactionalism come into play. And then, what signals he's sending on China. We're expecting, big tariff wars, but will he bring up fire and brimstone style rhetoric against China like he did against North Korea in early 2017? Or will he be more transactionalist and sort of bash China on trade, but also ramp up pressure on U.S. allies in Asia for, well, I guess, in his mind, taking advantage of U.S. military footprint and posture in the region in a way that could be advantageous to Beijing? Time will tell.
Well, Robbie, thank you so much for taking a few minutes in probably the busiest day of the year for you to speak with me. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.